holiday with tons of fireworks in my neighborhood. And I just want you to know that I watched TV and learned from NBC News that 1,000 dogs were microchipped in San Diego the week before July 4th because dogs get panicked when they listen to fireworks and they break out of their pens and yards and run off. And this was a great chance to microchip 1,000 dogs. So with that, I'm going to welcome my guest today, Joseph Atwill. I call him Joe. I've had Joe on before. He's a very, very fine scholar of conventional, recent history, and actually ancient history, culture, modern culture, and the debasement of modern culture. So how are you, Joe? Welcome.
Good, and I haven't been microchipped, so I'm still running free and wild.
Well, I bet you the dogs weren't just chipped here. They were probably chipped all over.
Yeah, the future doesn't look good when you think about the snooping and observation technology, right? So that's a sad thing. I was sad to hear that 1,000 dogs have been chipped.
Well, Joe, I would like to bring in today's topic. And I had sent you an alert a few weeks ago about what I was learning about the motion picture production code. And I was fascinated to learn that this was something that was implemented in 1930 so as not to have Hollywood directors and producers, filmmakers run wild with ideas in the area of sex and violence. So they installed this code. They didn't really get it going till 1934. In the meantime, films that actually openly violated the code, which was a moral standard, it was a form of self-policing, you could say, in the industry. They put films out like Frankenstein, and they put out The Song of Songs, which is very sexy, and a few others in those 4 years, 30 to 34. And then at about the 1934 point in time, they really started cracking down and films had to abide by the code. And then they loosened it tremendously in the 60s and it was abolished in 68. So that's my little intro and I'll let you carry on.
Well, the motion picture industry had been basically self-regulating, and there was a tremendous hue and cry coming up against it. People were seeing that movies could have a debasing effect on culture, that they were influencing people, particularly children, in bad ways. I mean, the films you mentioned, Song of Songs, with Marlene Dietrich, it didn't have Marlene naked, though it had many pictures and images of her undressing. But it had a life-size mannequin made from her, a statue, which was quite nude and then was exposed, just throughout the film. And so you could see that in pre-debasement America, this would have caused a tremendous amount of consternation. People would have tried to protect their culture, which was not a pornographic culture. Sex was an activity that was designed within the culture to be contained in marriage and was something that was private. Public displays of sexuality were basically regarded as pornographic and were seen and understood by the culture as things that would lead away from marriage. So what actually triggered the creation of the motion picture code was the Fatty Arbuckle event. He was a well-known actor who basically killed a woman with debased sexual activity. So this focused attention on Hollywood. And Hollywood was already under scrutiny as a place of depravity. People were talking about homosexuality being rampant inside the industry and pedophilia even. This was before the Fatty Arbuckle episode. But then after Arbuckle, there was so much reaction that they decided to create it. Now,
wait, let me ask you this, please.
Sure.
The Fatty Arbuckle incident, was that in a movie or not in a movie?
No, that was a real event. And Arbuckle was basically worked with Charlie Chaplin and was just a very popular film star. And he, this event was, it's almost too graphic to talk about, but he evidently had some kind of sexual perversion, which involved devices which are not part of the human body, and the woman that he was alone with died. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the power of the film industry, he would have been basically put in prison. I think he was convicted of manslaughter, if my memory serves. But anyway, so they decided that they would, get in front of this groundswell of resentment. And I mean by that, I mean the oligarchs that had created the film industry and who owned the studios. And so I just wanted, if you don't mind, just to return a second to the Arbuckle event before we move on from it. It was in 1921. They created a $100,000 fund to try to keep the matter quiet. This then got out. This fact got out, and there was then all kinds of editorials. The small newspapers, started to say, well, this whole industry looks like it's depraved. And so what happened is that they set up the NPPDA, the Motion Picture Production something, and this code basically was, they were saying, look, we're going to create these high standards for the production code. And they had brought in the Roman Catholics, and the Legion of Decency, was part of what was going to be represented. But in order to run it and to interpret the code, they brought in this guy Hayes, Will Hayes. And the code was, in fact, called the Hayes Code because it was just synonymous with him. I mean, he ran it, he operated it, he was the public face of it. And you can see that the code was always simply a propaganda device. And what I believe happened, Sophia, was that they wanted and knew very well they were going to take culture into a debased condition. The idea was to destroy the family, to create atomized individuals, isolated, single people without families, without ethnic communities, because these would be the easiest category of humans to enslave, right? It was always basically about control. This was what the motion picture business was designed to bring about. And so when they decided to create this publicity stunt of the production code, they brought in Will Hayes. And Hayes was famous as a Presbyterian, I believe. He wasn't Jewish, but in fact, was famous as this kind of Christian individual. But if you look a little deeper into his life, questions start to appear. The first thing that I would point out is that he actually was a propagandist. And this is what his training was. So he was there to fool people from the very beginning. I mean, he was never a moral leader. He had been in Indiana. And first of all, I would just point out that Hayes comes from Freemasonry. This is really where the studio heads got him. And if you want to understand the relationship between Freemasonry and sort of the Jewish oligarchs, because that combination appears so often, I would suggest the place that people start is just the cartoon Bimbo's Initiation, created by Max Fleischer. It's about this kind of idiot character Bimbo who is forced to become a Freemason. But in the cartoon, the character Mickey Mouse appears, so that you have Walt Disney working in cooperation with Max Fleischer. Disney is overtly a Christian, but of course, as is well known, he's a Mason. He, went to Demolay camp his whole childhood. This whole park, when it was set up, Disneyland was just an homage to Freemasonry. All of the rides were based on literary works of Masons, or were just out and out celebrations of them, like Davy Crockett. And so Disney, for some reason, let Fleischer borrow Mickey Mouse to use in this cartoon. And what Mickey's role is to lock Bimbo in the lodge so that Bimbo can't escape. Bimbo falls down a manhole, Mickey Mouse appears and then locks him in the lodge. Fleischer has a little kind of musical vignette to start the cartoon, and he gives a self-designation. He talks about who we are, and he says, "We are tough and mean." This is, in a cartoon for children, he's describing, Bimbo's initiation, and it says, we are tough and mean. And so then Bimbo is forced into becoming a Mason. It's a really important cartoon. People should take a look at it because there's a lot that's revealed by it. So anyway, when the Jewish oligarchs, there were some like Zanuck, I believe, who were not Jewish, at least overtly, but in large, it was seen. Certainly, was seen by the population. I can give you citations about how people look at this. So it was seen as a Jewish industry, and so bringing the Roman Catholics in, they were when the production code was created, the Catholics were brought in, and they were shown to the public that this is going to be influenced by the Catholics. But to run it, you have Warren Hayes, and Hayes was a propagandist and a Freemason. And in fact, the way that Hollywood knew about him was because he had worked for the Freemason Warren G. Harding presidential campaign. Prior to this, and this is really the key, is that prior to this, he had worked for the government of Indiana, the state of Indiana. And he was basically the first sort of PR person for a political individual, for James P. Goodrich. And then when the war started to look like it was going to occur, he went to work for the Committee on Public Information, the infamous Committee on Public Information. And this is why they chose Hayes, and this is where Hayes basically, comes into American culture. Because the Committee on Public Relation was run by Creel, George Creel, and Edward Bernays. And it was a propaganda device to basically go around the United States and to change public opinion concerning the war. The idea is that the Americans were in general isolationists. The people saw no clear reason for the war to exist, of course, and there wasn't any. It was just artificial construction. And the whole purpose of the war was population reduction. They were just going to push armies into one another with the new automatic weapons and reduce population. So the American people didn't want to do this. Wilson hired Edward Bernays, the arch criminal, and George Creel. Creel was Bohemian Grove, which is just a variant of Freemasonry. Creel lived after World War I. He lived at the Bohemian Grove. He spent the rest of his life actually in the Bohemian Grove building on Mason Street in San Francisco. So he disappears and into the building, never comes out again. Bernays goes on, of course, he was the kind of the founder of pornography. He created the play Damaged Goods, which basically described sexual activity overtly on stage. It was the first one. I've written about this. People interested, they can look at my work. You can see, like Manufacturing the Deadhead is one of the articles where I talk about Bernays and his background. But he was really, he was Sigmund Freud's double nephew. Both sides of his family were either the aunt or uncle of Sigmund Freud. So you can see it's a bizarre connection. Bernays is a propagandist. He's using kind of the Freudian psychological understanding of how culture operates to control society. And he works on the infamous Committee of Public Information. He creates like a poster of a gorilla with a German military suit, and the gorilla is holding a blonde, like he's going to rape her. And then there's propaganda slogans, patriotic slogans about stopping the Hun. And so this is where Hayes, is basically gaining his understanding about how to control populations with propaganda. So, and this was why he was hired. I mean, it's obvious, when you see his Masonic background and his working with Bernays, it's just as clear as a bell that this was why they picked him. So what happens is they start with this propaganda of how everything is going to get better. They're not going to have a depravity. And it's actually it's very important what they tried to sell with the propaganda things. And because it shows you what culture was like at the time that they brought it about. And the code actually had two parts. And it had sort of like general principles. And then it had specific behaviors that you couldn't, represent. And it's really important to look at these because this was, and the Roman Catholic Church had participated in the creation of these. And so this was what the culture really was defending and structured around. The general principles were just that, you wouldn't lower the moral standards with the film. That was just this very general principle. And that, you wouldn't ridicule law enforcement or you wouldn't create sympathy for violating law. Now, contrast that with the anti-hero, which comes around in the 60s. Someone like Easy Rider, who's the character is making their living selling cocaine, but he's the hero, right? So you see that when the code was created, they understood that, you could actually lower the standards of an individual, of a culture, through the motion pictures. And this is an important point.
Let me jump
Sure.
in here. I'm looking at the Fatty Arbuckle story. His name was Roscoe, and I don't mean
Yeah.
to backpedal too far, but he was very heavy, and the person he was involved with was this woman, Rappy, Rapppe.
Yeah, Virginia
Virginia Rappy. And she was a heavy drinker as well, and she apparently died of ruptured organs, including a bladder and peritoneum, and they thought that that might be due to the very heavy body weight of Arbuckle on top of her. But regardless, that was the first big Hollywood scandal, and a number of them followed. And as you said, this made it to the papers, to the Hearst papers.
Right.
And Hearst said, look, it sold more papers. This Fatty Arbuckle situation has sold more papers than the sinking of the Lusitania. So they apparently piggybacked on this big first major Hollywood scandal to then shun Arbuckle and say, he was an amoral person. We don't want his movies. We're going to cancel all of his contracts and never let him find work again, etc., etc. So to me, it seems like they were looking for an opportunity to come out with their morality, quote unquote. And they installed that in the form of the code through this Hayes individual that you have told us about. But what happened was, this is typical, if you tell a child you cannot have candy, then the child will want it. So by eliminating or forbidding certain kinds of, they wouldn't let you point a gun at the camera, for instance. You'll talk about more of that. But these elements of the code, the verboten things, they only increase the public's appetite for the very same stuff. And then they started to introduce it into movies by gradients and by suggestion. And that's how they moved us from, quote unquote, the strict Victorian morality of the public to people who were worshiping gangsters and coke dealers and the anti-hero, right?
Exactly. And that's so well said. Very concise. Absolutely correct. That's what they did, you see, is they wanted to move society into a more debased cultural state, particularly, less family production. So how do you get there? Well, you make the anti-hero, the person who actually creates sympathy for the violation of the law, you make him heroic. And how do you do that? You tell people you can't see him. You tell them, oh, no, we got to get this guy. This is how they create the interest in the individual. And then the second part, just to add on to what you were saying, the second part, as I said, the code, there was two sections to it. The second part was about so-called particular applications. And this was specifically about representations of homosexuality and miscegenation with, like sex between the races. These two aspects were the part of the code that were the most visible. So you couldn't represent homosexuality and you couldn't show black and white people having sex. Now, the code didn't work out too well, did it? You see, so the fact is that as I would look at this, particularly in the context of so many other things, that this was all done deliberately. These are the directions that they wanted to head culture toward. So by the creating of these restrictions, they basically were giving people the clues that this was something that was forbidden and therefore desirable. And now to really, understand that this is exactly what was occurring is that See, on one hand, you have Hayes supposedly being this, defender of American culture. But on the other hand, he is actually, what he's really doing is expanding the power of Hollywood. If you look into his speeches, what you'll see constantly is statements that there was an absolutely limitless power of movies to influence national life and taste and conduct. He actually uses this expression. He talks about that you can create common ideals. And remember, he's already been involved before he gets there with the creation of the culturally destructive propaganda that makes Americans accept the basically insane World War I Holocaust of the European people. So he's already done this. And now they move him into Hollywood, where he takes over the so-called production code. But all the time he's talking about, how he's going to be expanding the power of Hollywood. Now, bear in mind, okay, he was getting $100,000 a year being paid by the studios. $100,000. At that point in time, this would be like an income of $10 million or something. They took a $2 million life insurance policy out on him. This was the studio heads, because they knew that, or they were afraid that there was going to be a reaction against what he was going to do, and that his life would be in danger. That's how I recognize the insurance business. So what he does is he goes out to all of these places which influence American culture. You name the organization, and Hayes had some connection into it. And he is always saying that this is going to be good. This is something that's really important. He always promoted the expansion of the electric grid. And he was said to be obsessed with this. And it's because he said that the movies needed electricity in order to promote progress. Because, you see, you had to have electricity to promote the screen that would open the gates of the world to all mankind. And Hayes would talk about electric power being the ally, the indispensable friend of motion pictures. Now, think about, the grid we have today with, the Wi-Fi and the iPhone and, the electric world that we live in. Hayes is really probably, with Edison and Tesla, would be like the third most important person in bringing about this. He was at the very front of it. And what he would do is he would go around to all of these different little organizations, Kiwanis clubs, any kind of public gathering. He would try to have some kind of influence. He supposedly had relations with over 50 religious, civic, educational, and professional organizations. I mean, you name it, Boy Scouts, YMCA. He had a specific publicity person in charge of a relationship with these people to promote the electric grid and show business. Now, remember, now bear in mind, this is someone who was supposed to be brought in because there was concern about the influence of it. And yet you can see that this is obviously just the cover story, that Hayes is a lifetime actor, that he's been brought in to create to have a political cover, but to use that for the purpose of dramatically expanding the reach of Hollywood, of the filmmakers, of the media. So Hayes, he is a Mason. He purports to be a Christian, but I would just say that anyone who is, the high-level Mason is not a real Christian. I think that's always the case because, even though the oaths are secret, I think what common person can understand about them is that they're completely incompatible. The people who have been inside the thing, who've come out of Masonry, have said, look, the oaths are just completely distinct, and it's impossible to be both. So when someone is representing themselves as a Christian, but in fact is a high-level Mason, you have to be very, very suspicious of it. And by the way, when he retired, he was replaced by Jeffrey Sherlock, not a Mason, but one of the original Theosophical with Annie Besant. So again, you get people who can make the representation to the public of being Christian, but if you just scratch anywhere in back of their story, what you end up with is secret societies, and this is how they do it. So what happens, Sophia, is that they're incrementally moving basically to Miley Cyrus, to a pansexual horror Babylon character that can just all the time debase culture and be something that can destroy, any kind of hope for family production. But to get there, to make the transition from, the beginning of the 20th century to today, you have to do it incrementally and you have to have a cover story. And so this is why Hayes is brought in. This is why the code is set up. The code, the end of the code occurs with at the time when the Holocaust is becoming something that's very powerful culturally. And I think that the two events are related. I mean, the end of the code and the introduction of the Holocaust as a cultural element, to me, it just seems quite clear, is that the code was basically, because Hollywood was seen so much as something that was Jewish. I mean, I can give you quotes from people like Breen, who worked with Hayes. He was an underling to Hayes. He says that, and I'll read you the quote just to give you an idea of this. This is pretty much a standard understanding of what Hollywood was, and you'll understand why I'm bringing it up in a second. He said, Breen Roy says, Hollywood is a rotten bunch of vile people with no respect for anything beyond the making of money. Here we have paganism rampant in its most virulent form. Drunkenness and debauchery are commonplace. Sexual perversion is rampant. Any number of our directors and stars are perverts. 95% of these folks are Jews of an Eastern European lineage. They are probably the scum of the earth. So this is kind of basically the cover narrative. And Breen was was hired just to be a public anti-Semite, because that was the concern that culture had, is that this could be basically a Semitic plot against European culture. I think that's what Breen is referring to. That's what he's representing, that we're defending these issues. But then in the 50s, you have start to see the power of the Holocaust as a cultural element. And suddenly you have the ending of the code, which occurred slowly over time. You had the first instance that I'm aware of is when Samuel Goldwyn, he basically demanded that the production code be revised so that they, you started to have sexual images, which they didn't really pay attention to the code. And in fact, Breen wouldn't approve the film, I believe, The French Line with Jane Russell, because she had a risque bathing suit on. But then it just collapsed completely when Otto Preminger, he had a kind of an R-rated film called The Moon is Blue. And he basically just said, I don't care what Breen says, I'm releasing the movie.
Joe, I do have the impression that the ratings, the
right,
PG,
yeah.
G, PG, R, and X took the place of the code.
I
want to read just a few things that the code was, the don'ts and be carefuls that were proposed. They wanted to treat very carefully the issues of slavery, drugs, sex, sexual hygiene, scenes of childbirth, children's sex organs, ridicule of the clergy, profanity. If you were going to say God or Jesus Christ, you were going to use those in connection with religious ceremonies, not swearing. And then suggestive nudity, what else is there? Willful offense to any nation, race, or creed. And then they had the specifics, which were the use of firearms, brutality and gruesomeness, techniques of committing murder. These had to be carefully reviewed if they were going to be mentioned in films. Methods of smuggling, hangings, electrocution, sympathy for criminals, cruelty to children and animals, branding of people or animals, the sale of women or woman selling her virtue, rape, attempted rape, first night scenes, man and woman in bed together, institution of marriage, surgical operations, excessive or lustful kissing. So these were the things that they were saying we've got to be very careful not to show in too much detail or in a suggestive way, and thereby leading people astray. But I think that what happens is that when the bad guys, who are actually all for something, their way of life, when they jump into our lives and pose as good guys, meaning the Freemasons saying, I will be the one that describes the code
Yeah.
and enforces it, this Hayes guy. Then what they're really doing is saying, it's the fox saying, let me be in charge of the hen house and I'll protect it. So the idea wasn't at all to protect, but was to generally and gradually loosen up, loosen up. And as you say, it was in the 60s. Maybe it was parallel with the popularity of Holocaust subjects, which then would mean let's make movies about the Holocaust, and we would then have to show cruelty to people because this was the whole point of the story, right? And at the same time, though, I believe that they loosened up the code and then got rid of it altogether when they started the rock and roll scene in Laurel Canyon, because that was a place of depravity, wife swapping, drugs, nudity, craziness. And that was the birth of the music industry, the modern music industry, which has led us to really gross, the satanic groups and whatnot. But they had to get rid of the code at that point because they were creating these, very broad new
Right. And the
kinds of
code
popular culture.
had been basically prepared for extinction by the incrementalism. By they had slowly, produced more and more risque material. More and more of that stuff just became normalized. And so then when you basically switch to Easy Rider, right, which has sex and drugs and rock and roll, right? If you think of the movie Easy Rider, what is it? It's almost a non-existent plot, but it has lots of sex, lots of drugs, and the whole film is a MTV soundtrack. I mean, you've got just one rock and roll song after another. So that was basically where you're headed. This is where they want to take you. To get there, it took 30, 40 years, but they were able to do, and just like you say, when you get to the late 60s and early 70s, then there really isn't anything to worry about, because now they've got the code replaced with the age system where you can just put anything on as long as you have a PG-17 or something involved, as its designation.
Yeah, I'm looking at Easy Rider on Wikipedia. I don't think I've ever seen it.
Horrible film. I mean, there's no real storyline to the thing. It's just a couple guys driving around the country on motorcycles trying to sell cocaine, taking LSD. They go to a commune. They have sex with all kinds of different people, and the whole time there's rock and roll playing in the background. Easy Rider was just a straight shot into the end of the American family, And these are anti-heroes, right? These are individuals that could never have been brought to the American public at the beginning of the 20th century. So, this is why, like, looking into the background of Hayes, and particularly his relationship with Edward Bernays, is just, gives such a good, clear understanding of what happened. There was a group which we need to determine. It's absolutely critical we understand who these people are and what is in back of them. But they decided to shatter European culture. They wanted to atomize the family and the different ethnic components. Hundreds of different elements were brought into play. I mean, the aggressive anti-family feminism of Gloria Steinem, rock and roll music, Elvis Presley. I mean, these were all components of this assault. And now we have this, it looks like just a whirling cesspool of culture, but actually it's a very precisely designed weapon. And, I would just hope people would go back and look at the life of Edward Bernays and then compare that to what we have today. Bernays was involved with the beginning of sexualized music. He was the beginning of sexualized visual media. He began integration in America with the NAACP. He was the one who really introduced tobacco smoking into women, and feminism, right? He was like one of the fathers of feminism. But then it just gets bizarre. I mean, he was also responsible for fluoridation in water. I mean, if you just look at his life, it's just like one destructive act against culture after another. And so that's why when you see that Hayes is actually working with him and the Committee of Public Information, I mean, it's just an absolute red flag. And so then Hayes goes on, he creates a connection between Hollywood, and all of small town America. He said, we're going to sell America to the world. We're going to sell it, to all of the people in America. And he would make statements like public taste is malleable, to a certain degree plastic. He was speaking, with the Masonic group in 1934. It said it can be molded into better forms. See, public relation would take care of all of this. So this is Hayes is really an important person to know, to study, and basically to try to place in the context of how we got crushed, because you can see that the person that comes to us with the cover of he's here to protect the culture or to make it better. It's like the cultural Marxists. I'm here. We're here to try to help people, to liberate them. Marxism in general, right? The workers' paradise. You end up with everything being destroyed. So you really have to be very, very careful about people who come to you claiming that they're going to help your culture improve. You need to vet them very, very carefully, because when you look at how Hayes went out to, institutions like Catholic alumni, the Boy Scouts, the YMCA, the women's clubs everywhere throughout the United States, and then he would give them free movies, and actually arrange that there would be that the studio would send out stars or representatives to go along with the film. I remember as a boy, this was like kind of later than this, but I think it's part of the same process. I remember that Fess Parker came to Tokyo, where I was living, and had his buckskin fringe, outfit on, and they were going to do a special showing of, I think, Davy Crockett that he'd been in, or it's Fess Parker. Yeah, it was Fess Parker, and it was Davy Crockett. And so, this was what they did: is they promoted the connection to the media. So it didn't exist before, so it all had to be built. And Hayes was really there simply to have a cover story of he's there to make sure that the moral structure of the culture wasn't destroyed, but this was nonsense. He was there really just to use that as a way to open up markets for the Hollywood media. And then as soon as that had been done, then they would take advantage of it with movies like Easy Rider.
He supposedly said to a movie director, when you make a woman cross her legs in the film, maybe you don't need to see how she can cross them and stay within the law, but how low she can cross them and still be interesting. So he was actually encouraging, it sounds to me, the creativity. And then here in the code, under the general principles of the code, it says, general principle number 1, no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. But I just watched a movie with Cary Grant called Mr. Lucky. And this was a gambler. He was the gambler star of the film and the hero or anti-hero. And he went to work for a relief organization, a war relief organization, and he used his gambling skills and his gambling trickery to make money, to raise tens of thousands of dollars. I think it was ultimately $100,000 that they needed for relief, bandages and relief measures to send out to struggling and wounded soldiers. So I was surprised to see that this was paired, a villain, a gambler who is definitely on the wrong side of the culture, representing wrongdoing and crime. You could even go so far as to say evil or sin. And the plot makes him part of a wartime relief organization. And it's a love story. But I'm surprised, Joe, at the number of old movies I've watched, how insipid and weak and feeble the plot lines are, compared to films like The Godfather that I saw when I was, an adolescent, and that really disturbed me, and I couldn't even comprehend at all. I couldn't follow the plot. There are so many of these movies now that are movies about bad guys and gangsters that have such complex plots compared to the movies of the 40s and 50s. So, what is the purpose of that, can I ask you? I know this is a little bit of a
Well, I
digression.
know. I think that they just became more sophisticated in psychological control, and I would just point to the base that had been established in Laurel Canyon during World War II that studied special effects, and this was an enormous underground facility to which many of the Masonic and Jewish filmmakers and stars came for some purpose. I mean, it was top secret. But I would say there they were studying basically the visual impact of plot, and they were trying to determine the reason why. I mean, for example, they had like Marilyn Monroe would come. She was known to have attended the place. They gave as a cover narrative that they were going to do photographic recordings of the atomic bomb, but you don't need Walt Disney or Marilyn Monroe for that. So there was something going on there, and what I suspect is they were simply studying how basically to attack the subconscious, and they were trying to determine how to use the movies as neurolinguistic programming. And I don't mean to be long-winded, but the complex plots that you see, I think, are actually vetted. I know this is a conspiracy theory, but what I will point to an example that everyone can understand. When Gordon Wasson's story about the magic mushroom appeared in Life magazine, this was the beginning of the process by which psychedelic drugs would be acceptable to the American culture, right? It's the incrementalism we talked about that Hayes was part of with the video. So in May 1957, and anyone can do this, and I hope everyone who listens to this does this little exercise if they haven't already, just go to the cover of the May 1957 Life magazine, and you'll see that the story of Wasson's journey to the Mexican desert, where he meets supposedly a shamanist and then has these spiritual experiences with the psilocybin mushroom, which incidentally is complete fiction, or virtually complete fiction. It's described in the cover in a little black box. You can just pull the Life magazine up and you can see a little black box on the upper right side, and it has, strange adventures in the Mexican desert, strange visions in the Mexican desert. But the black box, even though the topics are not separated, there are three of them that are actually covered. The top one says Great Adventures, which describes an article supposedly in the magazine. But the more important one is the bottom one. It says Teenage Allowances. Right, Great Adventures, Teenage Allowances, and in between you have the propaganda piece that Gordon Wasson created, which was paid for by MKUltra, right, which is studying neurolinguistic programming, which is operating this secret base where they're bringing Hollywood producers, directors, and actors into Laurel Canyon where they have this thing hidden. MKUltra created that little black box, and what you're seeing is an attack on the subconscious. Everyone who knows that Wasson was, and now this is completely vetted, it's absolutely, they go to the Wikipedia on Gordon Wasson and you can actually go to the links for the MKUltra pay requisitions that Wasson issued. MKUltra studied neurolinguistic programming, and what you're looking at there with the black box is a little example of it. So you see the Mexican mushroom experience is a great adventure, and it's also teenage allowed. Teenage allowed, great adventure, the taking of the mushrooms. And then 10 years later, 12 years later, you have Woodstock. So that is a really good example of then why the plots they seem to be mysterious and complex. But I think actually like in The Godfather, what I would say is that there's just a way to disorient people with violence and sex. And then at that point, they've determined that they can insert cultural influence more precisely. So you have, the Michael Corleone character, who is an obvious anti-hero. He's someone who, murders. He has 2 wives, but he is completely, basically, someone who succumbs to evil. I mean, he starts out as kind of this friendly person and then ends up just murdering anyone who gets in his way. But see, this is basically, he's an anti-hero who's taking you away from the ability to have the kind of upstanding culture that permits a family and real relations and bonding relations and protective relations. Because ultimately, Sophia, what this all ends up with is atomized people. That's what the Godfather trilogy ends up with, is that people who go through that watching it, you're just slightly damaged. You're less likely to defend one another. You're more likely to be, out for yourself. What the Godfather produces is nihilism, because that's a great thing for an oligarch to have his subjects have as a philosophy, because a nihilist doesn't bond with other individuals. And so the more atomized we are, the better they like it. And so this is how you end up with, this absurd code, which ends up with every single principle that it supposedly is defending being more and more accepted, right, during this whole process. And then things like when the code was finally destroyed and they could just get at our mind in any way they wanted, you have Easy Rider and then the Godfather.
Joe, you were referring earlier to a military base. You just said base, but I want to clarify for people who are not familiar with it, that there was a military base in the Laurel Canyon area that claimed to be making military documentaries, but obviously all these other things were going on as well. And then the stars were visiting along with the Hollywood directors and whatnot. Also, I was just wondering if you think that in the context of Hollywood, that setting rather, if there was so much drinking and debauchery and drugs and mindlessness. These were people who were in an altered state of mind due to substances and the flowing of such substances, the free flowing of alcohol and drugs. And maybe they were not even aware of what was happening to them half the time, these actors and actresses. Even a lot of the people in the community. I know this, Joe. I live in sort of the backwater of LA, San Diego, and there is a fair amount of influx of Hollywood and people in the industries that operate in Los Angeles coming into San Diego. And I've also been to Los Angeles and I've known people who've worked in Hollywood. And they have always told me that Hollywood is it's like the Vatican. It's a country. It's like the city of London. It's like a place unto itself. You have to get onto those studio lots with special permission. And these Hollywood staffers, they are so well taken care of. They work from sunup to very late hours on the set. They're required to be there. They're required to give 150, 200% of what another job would ask you for. And there is just all these buffets. The food is catered. It's fantastic. There's no way you could say no to this because you're so well taken care of. And this is what makes you participate in all of this creation of cultural junk and makes you loyal, because where would you go that you would be that well fed and that well taken care of? Those studio lots are like little countries unto themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They use these tricks, and they are just tricks, to be able to get people to create media which is self-destructive. I mean, absolutely anyone who is morally upright should just walk right out of show business. I mean, it looks like a cesspool when you look at like Miley Cyrus or Lady Gaga or the orange is the new black, whatever that thing is. But it's not. It's a weapon. It's there to destroy culture. You're participating in your own self-destruction. Basically, you're like someone in World War I using an automatic weapon against, people coming at you that are being put into motion by the same group that is operating you. You're just a puppet that has only one trick, which is to destroy itself. And you talk about the fact that a lot of these people are drugged. I mean, you look at all of the problems that Marilyn Monroe had. I mean, to me, she seems like someone who really is trauma-based mind control individual. I don't know her life background, but I just, when you see how she's being used and then the bizarre death, it just seems like, and the fact that she did show up at this Laurel, she was known to have been at this base. Why was she there? I'm sure of it. She was there. They were using her to study the effects of pornography. The future of pornography is what they were trying to create, how it could best be used. And notice Hayes's comment about, the crossing, a woman crossing her legs. What he's trying to do is to find a way to have the mind be more, a male's mind, be more drawn to the act, but at the same time be able to take the position of like, well, look, the code is very, very strict, right?
That is the precursor to
Absolutely.
the famous shot of Sharon Stone in Basic Instinct. That went down in history. And that little line that he said, see how interesting you can make her by how low she crosses her legs, that is what led up to that famous Sharon Stone shot. So it's almost as though they've written the script beforehand, and the script is handed down generation after generation after generation.
Well, they
And
have.
yeah,
They
and
absolutely have. I mean, you look at the analysis I did of The Tempest, which is available. You can go to, there's no charge. It's a free article. It's on postflaviana.org. You can read the article I did on The Tempest, the play that Shakespeare wrote, where the expression Brave New World comes from, which is what Huxley then used as the title of a book which describes, a culture that is genetically controlled and that sex is rampant and there's no families, right? Well, he chose the title deliberately because he knew that the Shakespearean project back in the 16th century had these ideas specifically of how to enchant, which is to say how to basically put someone into a magical mindset where they're easy to control. This is the Brave New World, and this is how long the program has been going on, for hundreds and hundreds of years. When you come to Freud, where he's saying you're neurotic, there's some imbalance in your mental energy because you have restriction of your sexuality. And then you move immediately from there to Edward Bernays using his uncle's work as the basis for, the plays he's producing. Bernays is bringing out Nijinsky, the homosexual ballet dancer, creating a legal buttress so you can't stop him from coming to your town. And in one of the plays, Nijinsky mimes masturbation on stage, right? Well, you can see that, when you look at this as applied psychology, I mean, this is just clearly a weapon. It's like Hayes' statement. Hayes is supposed to be protecting culture. He's not supposed to be there giving clues to directors as to how to draw the attention to women's genitals, right? This is just completely opposed to what his public persona is. He's trying to unleash sexuality because he knows if sexuality is taken out of the context of marriage, it is then something that will split apart marriages. The basis of marriage to many males was that this was where sex was going to be permitted. And so this was why marriage was a good idea. And so if you could just get rid of that cultural premise, then you would be well on your way to the atomized world where everyone is separate and we're just easy to control because there's no groups that can organize and fight back. So this is I hope that your insight about Hayes's comments becomes more widely talked about on the internet and in other areas because it's so critical. It's so obvious to me that here you have an exposing of Hayes. They have the public persona. They always create a lifetime actor persona. But in back of it is the truth. In back of Gordon Wasson, you can see that he's just deliberately lying. He's creating this narrative about how safe and spiritually progressive drug use is, right? And when you scratch the surface and you find out that he's actually working for MKUltra, then you can see the truth. Gloria Steinem's feminism, which was a radical departure from the economic feminism that came before her, where she's, talking about a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. It's very anti-marriage feminism. So you scratch Steinem, and what do you see in back of her? Well, my gosh, she's a CIA agent. You look at Ms. Magazine, what do you see in back of it? Everyone who's funding it, the editors, they're all CIA related, right? It's coming from the same source that MKUltra, which was a CIA operation, is coming from. The CIA, of course, is not the problem. It's the group that controls the CIA that is the problem. And that's why, it isn't really Hollywood per se or media that is the problem. It is the group that controls it, the thing that is in back of it, the secret society that is determined to have world domination. That is the problem. And that's what shows like the ones you have are so good because it's waking people up to the fact that, wait a second, we have a real structural, political, cultural problem. The reason why our world seems like such a cesspool, and why wealth is so difficult to come by, and why degeneracy seems to be promoted at every turn, and why we're even losing the ability to have two sexes. These things it's not history unfolding. It's a plan being executed. People have to start to make that switch to wait a second, I'm not just watching history unfold here. I'm seeing a plan executed. The plan can be determined to go way, way back. Certainly was well in motion when Shakespeare's literature was being created. And when you get to Laurel Canyon and the cesspool that comes out of that, and notice the name of why Laurel, like a victory, right? So you have special effects, pornography, and the rock and roll, and particularly rock and roll promotes drug use and sexuality. It's all coming out of the same place. It's all just a project that we're being victimized by.
Joe, there's another thing to add about William Hayes, and that is that he was appointed Postmaster General. This was after he ran the campaign for Warren Harding, 1920 election. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but I know someone, I've interviewed her, I call her MK Ultra Zoe on my podcast, but Zoe's father worked for the post office, and for a long time the post office was part of government intelligence, because that's how you tracked people. You tracked them by where they lived, their postal address. And so the fact that Hayes, and actually the Motion Picture Production Code was also known as the Hayes Code.
Right.
The fact that Hayes was Postmaster General from 1921 to 22 suggests that he was quickly dipped into U.S. intel. So then when you have the code named after him, it's actually like an intelligence code.
Exactly right. That's absolutely clear. And in between that, he's in the Committee for Public Information working with Edward Bernays, which is basically the psychological foundation of military intelligence. So it's just a straight shot of the secret society using government to control us. And people don't realize that. It's a good point. I'm glad you brought that out, that the iPhone of its era was the postal system, because it was a way to have addresses of individuals. You have to imagine the plan of having control, domination of the human population. You have to have them identified. You have to have them located. And then you have to have, control over their activities. Now you have the iPhone. You know where they are. You can communicate to them whenever you need to. And now they'll be getting rid of cash, and you'll just have your financial capacity will all be controlled through this little device. Well, this has taken hundreds of years to create. And when Hayes was trying to bring about the acceptance on a wide scale of postal addresses in Indiana, he was part of the project. Even then, I suspect that he was already trying, with the idea of no free being, of all human activity being controlled and observed and identified and categorized and in possession of the oligarchs who are basically running and owning society. And so that's why, Hayes is often cited today as sort of the defender of American culture. People talk about, the Hayes Code as like, gosh, if only we could go back to that noble era. Well, I'm sorry to say, he was a well-known Mason. And this is the thing, is that there's a video on YouTube called A Conversation on LSD, which is really just the MK Ultra Union Party. It was shot in the 70s. Tim Leary's there. And you've got this bizarre combination of Jewish psychologists, Nicholas Burkell, Styron, Sidney Cohen. There's just a whole clump of them. And then individuals with background in Masonry. Tim Leary, who is on video saying that, he was basically just here to further the works of Aleister Crowley, right? Humphrey Osmond, who's Aldous Huxley's Masonic partner. So you have this strange connection between secret society and people who have as a personality, basically Jewish psychologists, Jewish human studiers, you know. And so that would be a relationship, I think, that really needs a little more scrutiny. Because with Hayes, you have the same thing. You've got Hayes, the Mason, who then turns over the reins to Geoffrey Sherlock, who is the Theophist, which is just another form of Freemasonry. And he's working and being paid $100,000 by basically a collection of Jewish media oligarchs. Well, what is the relationship? How do they actually get along? How does a Presbyterian individual like Hayes work with the Jewish oligarchs? Now, people have said, well, they deliberately chose him because there was anti-Semitism and he was a defense. Okay, that makes sense, but how do they get along? How aren't they worried that Hayes will actually work against them? Isn't it amazing that Hayes is always working for their interests and not for culture, not for the Presbyterian culture? How is this relationship organized? And I've advocated time and time again. I said, look, we need genetic testing. I want to know what the family relationships are between these groups. Whenever you have a group like this, you need to have some understanding of what's holding it together. Now, many people, you know, suggest there is some kind of overarching agreement between secret societies to rule the world. Okay, that's possible. We need to have the genetic information to know what we're dealing with. Hayes's background is into propaganda, the way his personality was created. This is deep. I mean, you're talking about someone whose life was being structured at a very early age, you know, for what he eventually becomes. We have to know what's in back of that. And as you and I sit here, we don't know. So that's why I've said, you know, Hayes, really good person to understand. And the principle of trying to get to the bottom of these things through genetic testing, I think, is a really valuable avenue. I hope it gets followed.
Just to clarify something, because when you said it, I was curious and I thought otherwise. The naming of Laurel Canyon was likely for the laurel that grows there, which is it's a decorative plant that grows in Mediterranean or oceanic climates. So that's what.
Oh, absolutely. I know that. But my point is, they chose it because of the name. They could have put these things anywhere. The name is what amused them, and so they put it there. They as I understand them, they have a kind of a sense of humor, and the idea that the canyon was named Laurel was just something that caught their attention. The idea of a victory over the culture they were going to destroy, and so that's why they placed it there. I once looked at this. The development, even before the military base, goes into some very bad individuals. I can't recall them all right now, but when I went into the deep background of Laurel Canyon, I found that actually it basically looked like it had been developed by individuals with connections into masonry and all kinds of culturally suspicious things. And so all I can say is I see them as very long-standing in their worldview. The secret society, they think out generations into the future, and so it wasn't surprising at all to me that the canyon was named Laurel. I think it may have been something that amused them.
Laurel Canyon, after it was originally inhabited by indigenous Indians, the Tongva, and it was spring-fed, so there was a stream that provided year-round water, which in a dry, before irrigation, all this artificial irrigation in California, you needed water here. And then that water source attracted Spanish ranchers who started grazing sheep. This is 18th and 19th centuries. And then after the Mexican-American War and United States statehood, the area was settled, now this is very interesting, by Americans interested or after water rights. So that's why you're saying that the power-hungry heavy brokers came in.
Yep. Well, and also their connections. I'd have to go back. I actually have something I wrote like 10 years ago about this. I have to look it up. But I believe it all connects into John Dewey's family, and it's just a miserable cesspool of development of techniques to control societies. But I don't have it. I'm sorry, I just don't have it at my fingertips or my mind at the moment.
Well, the traces are still, you can see it on Wikipedia. After the heavyweights were living there, it was then subdivided and marketed as mountain vacation properties, which would have drawn naturally all of the stars. And that's why you started getting the Hollywood people. But you also got the shipping of military children to the area by none other than the powers that be, the CIA and their executive arms. So the creation of the counterculture with that studio on Lookout Mountain. So it all kind of fits together.
It does, yeah, and you know it's hard to get it completely nailed down. I mean, it's a secret society, and it's one that uses the secrecy of military intelligence, so it's very difficult, you know, to get it nailed down as tightly as some people would like. But you know, we have so much evidence that the government is meddling in our culture. Projects like MK Ultra and feminism, you know, and the influence, you know, in the drug culture, we're entitled, citizens are entitled to try to use analysis, to try to use it, what evidence we have, to then try to use that in analysis to come to conclusions. What we really want to do is to create a demand on the part of the public for exposure. We really want people to say, you know, there is so much here that's being hidden. It's so clear that they will start to demand that, you know, you start to actually have the government open up the books, right? That you will elect politicians who are specifically saying, look, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to try to open the books up. I'm going to try to find out what really happened with MK Ultra. I'm going to try to find out what really happened with feminism. I'm going to try to find out what really is going on between the motion picture business and our government and the oligarchs, right? And I would like to find what's really going on with the psychological sciences and with culture creation. See, this is what we want is politicians who will get in there, with citizens that are skeptical and wary and understand, and electing politicians that are courageous and will say, you know, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to clean house. We only need a few of them to get in there and to put out enough truth so that the whole population then realizes how dangerous this society is, and we start to expose it.
Well, Joe, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't share that view personally. I think what you'll get if you get politicians like that, you're just going to get more plane crashes and heart attacks and sudden disappearances. And
you need courage if you're going to get into this world.
Courage is met with those kinds of accidents.
Well, you know, they can definitely execute lots of people and kill lots of people, but the information can spread even faster. So the question is just how quickly can the information get out? I think it's up to people who are aware to do what we can to try to get people up to speed with what we're aware of, what we know, and hopefully those people will then take the same step, and then you can have a viral kind of relationship where you get millions and millions of people. I don't think that, you know, if there was like 20 million zealots in the United States demanding that this get exposed, that the government could really resist, because if you got that number, you'd have 10 times that in a month. You see what I mean? In other words, you'll get to a certain tipping point, and then the whole thing will just collapse. So then what will happen is that people will know that the media is completely fake, and they won't buy anything it says. Suddenly CNN and Fox News and the New York Times and all of the oligarch-controlled propaganda devices will just be exposed as being ludicrous. They're just here to fool me. And then there will be chaos after this, but there will also be a lot of energy to get to the bottom of everything. And, you know, it isn't so much a question of optimism. To me, it's just there isn't really any other choice, so we have to do it.
Well, that's the choice on the level of the third dimension, but I think this is metaphysical, and you and I part ways on that terrain. So I don't know that I am going to ever see, and I don't expect to see, a resolution happening in the real world, because there just isn't that kind of interest. The people have been disengaged from their own self-preservation, and they would rather be entertained. And when you look at something like the Motion Picture Production Code, whose entire aim is to loosen moral standards, it's to change us from being thinking and reflective and self-protective and concerned with the welfare of others and ourselves, into people who are triggered by base instincts, the instinct for laughter, which is pure stupid comedy entertainment, and the instinct for love has been reduced to sex. And there's been this reduction, this dilution of basic desires and needs. So the need for the expression of joy has been translated into chuckling at funny jokes. And this is what we do all day long. This is what people do. This is what they gravitate toward.
Well, they want to have they have the expression happy. Kim Kardashian on mood elevators. It's this happiness thing is sort of like a drug that people were pulled to. They're and a goal they have, even though it's complete illusion. What we need is to restore the values of strength and virtue, and the sense that these are the ways to live the best life: physical, psychological strength, and with the aspiration of virtue, of living as well as you can, not just for yourself, but for the family, the ethnicity, and the people that you're part of. Strength and virtue.
Well, you sound like a moralist right there. But I'm going to say this to the listeners, that it's up to each of us to define what we value as important and then to go after its implementation in our lives and in the lives that we touch. That's about the best we can do right now.
It's at least a step in the right direction. I don't think we'd have any, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. But I just say beyond it, as we become more free, we should try to keep in mind that we are capable of living in a world where the humans all attempt to have strength and virtue, and maybe we'll get there someday. We'll just see.
That's good, Joe. I never heard you sigh like that. But all right, so we'll end on that note. Maybe, on a big maybe. And thank you for coming back and discussing all this and for your preparation.
Oh, thanks for the time, Matt. I appreciate being on. I always love talking with you.
Well, you're very welcome, and I will chase down another rabbit trail,
Let's
another
talk
time.
soon. Absolutely.
Okay. Hi, this is Sophia. I would like to tell you about Restore, a product I recently discovered that's pretty amazing. Restore addresses gut biome issues, which are apparently the root of nearly all health disorders. I've done a lot of study on Restore and what it actually does for you, and I'm very impressed. Restore was formulated by Dr. Zach Bush, a cancer researcher who left that line of work to pursue health and health care in a whole new way. You can listen to the long podcast I did with Sage of Quay on carbon, bacteria, and the soil. Search Small Storm blog for this, and you will learn that pretty much all of us have monogut, a very limited bacterial biome due to changes in our soil over the past couple of generations. Dr. Bush explains that bacterial metabolites signal to our cells and regulate our health in a very important and specific way. Also, our gut firewall or membrane must function correctly, which it no longer does with all the toxins and pollutants around us and in us. Restore is a lignite extract that is lab tested, and it's the first formulation I've ever gotten this excited about. Please visit avatarproducts.com to try a bottle.